These are tense times that we're living in. Nerves are short, tempers are fraying. But in this era characterised by widespread political division, I'm sure that there is one thing that everybody watching today can agree on, and that is meeting Liz Truss really took it out of the Queen. I'm Darren McGarvey. Welcome to Darren McGarvey's Common People, where we look at issues of culture, politics and class, and I try to give you my take on whatever I'm feeling particularly interested in that day. Today I want to talk a little bit about mental health, which understandably is a different sort of topic for every person depending on their experiences of either having mental health issues, mental illness, or supporting people through things like that. So I'm going to try and be mindful of my tone and also mindful of the fact that this is just my opinion based on my experience and based on where I am at now. So there might have been previous times in my life where I might have disagreed quite strongly with how I feel today. And I think that is the nature of growth and maturity. You would hope that you would look back at things you used to think and think, oh my God, I hope Facebook doesn't remind me that I used to say that when I was running about in my 20s. So if you'll bear with me, basically I want to talk about a tweet that I seen the other day, which was by a Twitter account called The Wounded Healer. This is a guy who is pretty well-known NHS mental health professional. Now, the tweet in question has since been deleted. Now, I can't speculate as to why it's been deleted, although I will admit that I did fire off a few angry responses to the tweet and also a thread where I quoted the tweet. But I'll paraphrase it as charitably as I can and as accurately as I can. And basically, the Wounded Healer was suggesting the following to his 100,000 plus followers. He said something along the lines of, the best way to test a person's character is how they treat you when you're at your most vulnerable. Now, word for word, verbatim, that might not be exactly what he said, but you're getting a sense of the tweet. Now, on the surface, that seems like a kind of uncontroversial thing to say. What he's alluding to is when you're vulnerable, then that is a time where you are kind of maybe mentally or physically weak, or maybe you're at some kind of economic disadvantage. And so obviously anybody of low character who would be looking to exploit that vulnerability would see that as a kind of prime opportunity to take advantage in some way, whether that be power play, whether that be bullying, whether that be exploitation. And so on the surface, that doesn't seem like that big a deal. But it struck a nerve with me because I remember many instances in my life where I myself was, in a sense, vulnerable, whether it be due to my alcoholism, drug addiction, and the mental health issues that are always kind of attendant with that. And I remember, as well as being vulnerable though, I remember being pretty difficult to deal with. I remember not being very open-minded or willing to take guidance. So I had a mental health problem and I was vulnerable, but there was also a level of culpability at play for the fact that my problems were as prolonged as they were. And the reason that my issues began to get more difficult, more complicated, was in part not just because of the socioeconomic, material conditions in which, you know, my mental health and circumstances all evolved, but also because there were suggestions made to me at different points as to what some of the roots of my issues might be on an individual level. And I was not ready to accept some of those difficult truths. So with this tweet, then the problem that I had with it in the first instance was that it was a bit too vague to be helpful. It was a bit of a platitude, and it's quite popular for social media personalities, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this myself, to speak in kind of one-dimensional terms about certain topics like mental health. And while obviously I can imagine that a tweet like that might have been supportive or encouraging for some people or validating for others, at the same time, I did react, I think, in quite a visceral way, where I was almost sort of offended by it. And that was partly for the reason I describe there, where there were times when I was vulnerable and maybe I expected a bit too much of people around me. Now, from a place of vulnerability, a mental health issue that's being exacerbated by lifestyle choices like alcohol and drug use and denial about the effect that these are having. If you're vulnerable in that way, is it helpful when a mental health professional encourages you from that place of vulnerability, from that place of a lack of insight, a lack of open-mindedness, and where you're looking at the world through a variety of lenses which are not necessarily giving you accurate data about what is going on? Is it healthy for a mental health professional to encourage you then from that position of vulnerability to start performing character assessments of people around you? And what does he mean by see how they treat you? What is our expectation of how we should be treated when we're vulnerable? Obviously, we should not expect to be ridiculed or invalidated. We should not expect to be dismissed, although some of these things can happen, and sometimes we can interpret that they're happening when we don't actually know whether they're really happening in reality. And so asking somebody from a place of vulnerability, particularly a mental health vulnerability where our perceptions of what's going on can sometimes be questioned, then I don't think that it's solid ground to be making assumptions about other people's intentions, other people's motives, or other people's circumstances. The other thing is, bound up in what he said is an expectation of others, an expectation that others possess the skills, the knowledge, the energy, the wherewithal to rise to the challenge of our unmet needs at all times. And if they are unable to do that, does that indicate that they're of low character? Does that indicate if they decide to step back after maybe a prolonged period of offering us guidance, offering us support, being there to listen, and then actually finding that they also have mental health problems because what's going on in their life? If somebody withdraws from a relationship for a period, is it helpful to be encouraged to make an assumption about why that is? Because the meaning that we make of why somebody is not giving us the support that we need could actually make the mental health problem worse, especially if we're viewing it with a kind of impaired sense of what is actually going on. And that is another reason why I think that it's unhelpful. Also think kind of bound up in that is this idea that all mental health problems are absolutely separate from any sense of accountability. As I've said before, if my mental health problem is evolving around continued alcohol and drug use, and people have indicated to me that that's a problem, and I decide to take no action, or I decide to be oversensitive about that truth being pointed out to me, is that person obliged to still walk alongside me despite the destruction that they can see that I'm causing in my own life? Or are they within their rights to protect their own mental health by, as I say, withdrawing for a period, reflecting for a period? And ultimately, what sort of support are we looking for? Are we looking for people just to validate how we feel all the time? Because obviously there's the material reality of our circumstances which are harder to dispute. If we have physical problems, if we're living in poverty, if we're being fucked around by public services which are strained to absolute capacity. But then there is all the subjective stuff about how we feel about it all and the meaning that we make of it all. And sometimes a true support structure and a true friend is the person who tries to intuitively sense when is the appropriate moment to maybe pose a difficult question or to challenge our perception. Because actually, if we are in a prolonged place of vulnerability and everyone around us becomes frightened to point out some obvious truths, this actually leads to a deterioration in our mental health, because it leads to a deterioration in our attitudes and our behaviour, because we're not being subjected to the same forces of accountability that we would be if we were regarded as less vulnerable. And that's a really difficult paradox of long-term mental health issues, because naturally there is a tension between the level of sensitivity and how cautiously people must approach us because they understand our vulnerabilities, but also there is a need for friends and family and people with insight into the individual and the circumstances to have a duty of care, not to sugarcoat certain things, and to point out or try to offer guidance when it seems appropriate. Now, when I fired off the thread, I was triggered for a couple of reasons, because I see this from two angles. One, being that person who had high expectations of how other people could behave, how other people should behave, and really did take a lot of resentments and felt very much aggrieved when people started to drop out of my life, because from my place of vulnerability, then I was making some big assumptions about why they did that. And I was beginning to see everyone around me, not as a person with their own circumstances, their own challenges and their own limitations, but I was putting them on pedestals, which very few people could ever actually live up to. And then I was punishing them for not being able to meet those high expectations. These are difficult things to discuss, but ultimately what was happening was every relationship was being viewed through a lens of what I thought other people should be doing for me. And that was part of my particular mental health problem. My particular mental health problem was that I had grown quite selfish in my addiction. I was not capable of dealing with honesty, so I would reject it reflexively and then speculate as to the ulterior motives of anyone trying to tell me the truth, because it was uncomfortable. And so what I would do was I would keep people around me who understood that I couldn't be challenged in certain ways, or other people who had similar blind spots due to their own mental health issues or addictions. And so we develop a kind of cozy consensus that how we're behaving in our lives is okay and is above reproach because we're vulnerable and we can't be challenged about anything. Now, if anybody is kind of feeling a wee bit delicate about how I'm speaking about this, please understand this is just my perspective based on these particular tweets, and why I feel that if you're going to go there with talking about vulnerability and encouraging anyone experiencing vulnerability to make assessments of the character of people around them, then you have to lay out a bit more context. Because here is the context, right? Some of us who come from certain backgrounds over the last 10 years will have noticed that we have lost friends to suicide. We've lost friends to alcoholism, to addiction, to deaths of despair. And every time that happens, it sends a ripple of trauma around the community, whether it's community of drug users, of drinkers, of family, children, friends. And what this does is it places further weight, responsibility and burden on those people who are still alive, carrying that cross. Now, in a community where there is a kind of dense agglomeration of mental health issues of increasing complexity, then something like lockdown, something like austerity, something like the cost of living crisis, and these are all things that are kind of intertwined right now and have synthesized to create hellish conditions. That means that everybody in our social network is struggling with something. Every single one of us is dealing with a vulnerability at the level of our person. Every single one of us is always being called upon to support 1, 2, 3 or 4 other people who are also dealing with it, but perhaps more acutely and constantly. And so the reality is that as more circumstances produce more difficulties, then our capacity to rise to the challenges that we see with friends and families is diminished. It's much harder for us to rise to the needs of others when our own needs aren't being met. And the Windy Tailor makes no account of any of this, no account of any of it at all. I punish myself every day thinking of the friendships are no longer present in my life as a result of the complexity of mental health issues at both ends of that relationship. I think of friends who have died. I think of family who have passed away. I think of people who have relapsed. And at every instance, I think, was there something more that I could have done? I think of conversations that I could have had with someone a couple of days before it turned out that they had decided to end their own life. Such was the pain that they were experiencing. And it would really hurt me. It would really upset me to think that any time I have not managed to meet the expectations of someone who was looking to me for help, that it was being assumed by them that I was of low character, that people could die as a result of their problems, and that my low character could be one of the ingredients in the mix. Because I can tell you, no amount of individual resilience, no amount of accountability, no amount of well-meaning intentions is enough at the level of the community to offset the massive systemic issues that are creating the fertile ground for these complicated, multifaceted mental health problems. And if someone has a platform with 100,000 plus followers and they are an NHS professional, then I would strongly advise them to think a bit longer before tweeting out some platitudes, because sometimes we can't help. Sometimes we are struggling ourselves, and that's not because of low character. And assuming that the way that someone treats you when you're vulnerable is automatically nefarious, you have to elaborate a little bit, because how we perceive we're being treated is often as much to do with our mental health as anything else that is going on in reality. Encouraging people to speculate about other people's motives, other people's circumstances, other people's intentions, other people's capacities is in itself encouraging people to get trapped in circular thinking, which any mental health professional understands or should understand is a massive contributing factor to long-term mental health problems, because that creates grounds for paranoia. That creates grounds for assumptions where we make the wrong meaning of something that has happened, and then we experience additional pain from creating a new story around something that might not actually be the case. I'm just going to leave it there today for that. Please do leave some comments below. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. I know it's a controversial thing to touch, and I know that it has to be handled sensitively, because when we're in the vulnerability, any kind of talk of accountability or the notion that we might play some small role in not exactly helping on mental health issues, and I allude to that when I talk about my own addiction and my lifestyle and my behaviours and my attitudes and how these made it harder for me to move through problems. But I do think if we're talking about it honestly, and if I'm honouring my true experience and how I truly feel, then I do have to approach it in a way that might be upsetting or offensive for some people, but I hope not so upsetting that you think me of low character, because I'm coming from a place of genuine care to the point where I wouldn't try and condense any serious discussion about mental health into a 140 character tweet. Like, subscribe, share the shit out of it. Thanks for checking all the previous videos, and I'll just leave it there for today. Thanks.